Welcome to Lecture 13 in Module 213, Physical Disabilities and Personal Care. This is the last video lesson from me, but again, it's very important to watch all of the other videos that I include on the course page. Those links will take you to videos that physically demonstrate how to do many of the personal care techniques. They're not optional links, they are required, and it's really important that you use them. It's also important that you look at the readings I have accompanied here. And as you'll see at the back of this particular video lecture, you'll also be expected to go and Google something, and that has to do with your personal rights as an employee and the rights of your employer under WorkSafe BC. So make sure you Google that information and are prepared to talk about it during review and on the test. In this particular video, we're going to focus on how to make sure that you and your coworkers stay safe when you are involved in personal care. And we're going to focus particularly on something called universal precautions and on back care. Universal precautions are really the term we use to make sure that we don't get sick from infectious disease. We treat every person in every situation as though it is infectious, and this is particularly focused on any type of body fluid or any surface like clothing or bed sheets or bathroom surfaces or equipment like toothbrushes that might be in contact with any type of body fluid. One of the things we do is use personal protective equipment, which is often shortened into PPE. These include disposable gloves, and by now you should understand the correct way to take off and dispose of those gloves so you don't cross-contaminate, so you don't waste what the glove is doing. We'll also use face masks or protective masks. These masks are really meant to protect us if the other person is potentially sick, but they can also provide a small amount of protection if you might potentially be coming down with something. Now, of course, you shouldn't be at work if you're infectious, but sometimes we don't quite know whether we're infectious, and so a mask might be something you wear for that purpose. It's important to make sure that whether you're using the gloves or the masks, you're using medical grade equipment. The sorts of gloves that you see at sandwich making restaurants or in a box of hair coloring are really not going to do anything for us because they're not guaranteed to be sealed and they split very easily. Similarly, masks that you might buy at a Home Depot are not going to provide the type of protection that we're talking about here because we're talking about viruses and bacteria that are very small. So they need to be particularly well fitting and they need to be really good at filtering. Pocket masks are a little bit different. There should be in your first aid equipment. A pocket mask is a mask that has a one-way valve so that if you have to rescue breathe for somebody, the air from your lungs goes into theirs, but the air that they exhaust is directed elsewhere so that you don't breathe in what they may have had. And you can see that those masks really are there to protect you and not the individual in that crisis. So PPE is focused predominantly on the staff person, although some types of PPE are working both ways. Eye and face protection is also important, whether you're talking about your own glasses or safety goggles or glasses which cover more of our face, or face shields which cover our entire face. And these are particularly useful if you're working with people, for example, feeding somebody and you're concerned that they may cough and spit up food, or if you're giving a person a bath or a shower and you're worried about overspray. So these are not always concerns or not always big worries, but they are particularly right now as we're talking about things like COVID, or even during flu season, or when we know a person has a diagnosis of a particular disorder. And we often have clothing protectors like aprons or disposable gowns, and we may also want to make sure that we are particularly good at covering any wounds we may have. So if you're walking around in your day-to-day life without a bandage over a cut, but you know you're about to do personal care, it's really important to make sure that you cover that wound with some kind of a dressing so that any body fluids from the other person can't enter. Another important universal precaution is sanitizing. Sanitizing surfaces, dishes, and other implements, for example, using a solution of bleach and water. And bleach is really the recognized disinfectant. Believe it or not, the Assisted Living Act regulations stipulate what disinfectants are allowed. And there are very few, and bleach is by far the most cost-effective and most proven. And we don't use the bleach in undiluted form. We usually measure out a proportion of about 1 to 30, depending on what the regulations require. And that's just weak enough that it's not likely to cause your clothing to become bleached if some splatters on you, or the rug if some splatters on the rug, although it wouldn't take much more than a 1 to 30 concentration for that to happen. But we usually use it to clean surfaces, for example, in bathrooms, in kitchens, in dining areas, anywhere where we might have body fluids. We also use that bleach in the laundry. Again, not a lot. Even if we're washing colored laundry, we're going to use a small amount of something that will disinfect, like bleach for unbleachables. We also use dishwashers to disinfect all of our dishes and utensils, and we don't put bleach in. Instead, we use the sanitized setting, which uses a high temperature to kill germs and therefore keep things clean. So sanitizing is very important. You might have thought that by sanitizing I was referring to washing your hands. That's also very important, and understanding the correct way to wash your hands, and I'll put up a video about this, is very important. Very few people wash their hands correctly or wash them long enough. And they often miss the very places that are most likely to actually have germs. So it's important to make sure that you wash your hands correctly. And it's also important to make sure that when you do not have access to hand washing, you use hand sanitizer, and again, apply that correctly. Hand washing before you do something is important as a way of making sure that you don't convey a disease to the people you're there to support. It's also an act of consideration. But in terms of the universal precaution, it's the opposite that we're looking at. It's the washing you do after personal care with somebody. And so even if you've worn gloves, you should still wash your hands. Again, that's true of whether you've put away dishes in the dishwasher or filled the laundry machine with dirty laundry. All of those are circumstances where you should wash your hands afterwards. Going in and out of a bathroom that's shared, again, really important. Prevention in general. So learning how to prevent by using materials that don't get reused, such as disposable gloves or disposable wipes, making sure that anything that is used more than one time, for example, washcloths or towels, gets frequently laundered. We don't reuse those things. We're much more careful than we might be in a home. Disposable cups in the bathroom. We would never use, for example, a reusable cup in the bathroom. We'd always use something that got thrown away, or to be honest, we'd rarely leave a cup in the bathroom. We'd usually bring something in for a person and then take it and put it immediately in a dishwasher. And safe disposal of anything that might be contaminated, including menstrual products, anything used by a person, for example, a Kleenex, any sharp containers such as the lancet that is used on a glucometer, all need to be properly disposed of. There are biohazard containers available on the market, and those are particularly useful for sharps. They're usually hard. They usually have a kind of a flap on top that makes things less likely to fall out. They're labeled with the biohazard symbol, and when they're thrown away, they can be sealed up so that the product is not likely to affect other people unsuspectingly. In some cases, a specific garbage can in the home may be designated for materials like old gowns or gloves used to give medicines. And usually what we do is we just simply have something on that garbage can that labels it as the biohazardous waste container, or we might have special garbage bags. It's very important to make sure that staff understand when there's something in a container that could infect them. So let's say, for example, you had to do a cleanup in a property or in a home or a facility after somebody threw up, and you threw paper towels into a garbage can. You would either go and dispose of that directly in something like a dumpster, or you would leave a note for the custodial staff or whoever is supposed to take it out to be very careful with that particular receptacle. I would literally leave a note on the bag, or leave a note in a communication book that they read before they go and do their shift, so that they make sure they're not unwittingly going to be exposed to this. So make sure that you use these universal precautions whenever you are around any potentially infectious situation, not just when you know that somebody is infected. Back care is the second thing we want to focus on here. It's very common for people to hurt their backs or to have other orthopedic issues such as knees or legs, and much of what we'll talk about here will affect those parts of the body as well. One of the most important things to understand is that it's very rare nowadays for people to do manual lifts of people that have physical disabilities. You will almost always have access to a lift or some type of mechanical assist. Even in a power outage, most of them have a reserve of battery power so that you can still use them. Occasionally there may be a breakdown, or occasionally you may be in a circumstance where somebody cannot be lifted with a device, and you should use the lifts that you have properly been trained on when that happens. But every other time you should use the lift and assist that's available. And I see people kind of cutting corners on this because they think, oh, it's too much of a pain in the butt, or it's too slow. But in the end, if you injure yourself when you are supposed to be using a mechanical assist, then you are not going to be covered because you haven't been doing what you're supposed to be doing. And a lot of people don't understand this, that the law says you are not going to get covered if you're doing something outside of what your job duties require. So use lifts and assist when available to you, and understand if you do have to use a physical manual lift, get trained in how to do that. There's often nuances or differences for specific individuals. For example, some people need 3 individuals to lift them, or there's specific positions on the body. Avoid sudden or unexpected movements. For example, I wouldn't lift somebody who seemed agitated, because if they struggle, that's a very common way for us to have a back injury. I wouldn't lift somebody if I was in a circumstance where I wasn't sure whether or not footing was stable, because again, adjusting might mean that I tweak my back or create some kind of injury. Know your own personal limits and make sure that you are staying in good shape. Over the course of our careers, we often put on weight and think of ourselves as being as fit as we were when we were younger. We often have lost some of our capacity. So really maintaining our personal health and fitness is important, and knowing our limits. Especially if we've had a prior injury of any kind, we are often likely to re-injure those same areas. Get help when other people are around, including spotters. I'm sorry, that last 0 should be the end of a parentheses. Spotters are people who watch to see whether or not there's something that you might trip over, or if a door is closing on you, or if an individual is coming into the picture to talk to you and perhaps be a distraction. So if you can get help with things that are physical, you should do so, even if that person's job is just to help watch out for hazards. Maintain equipment and environment. Make sure that, for example, the floor doesn't have slippery carpets on it or wet spots. Make sure tripping hazards in general are removed. Maintain the equipment itself so that you don't find yourself in a public place unable to use a wheelchair lift or unable to use the wheelchair itself. Look out for any kind of hazard in the area. Make sure you use the correct tool for the job. So for example, if you want to change a light bulb, you should get a step ladder. You should never use a chair or a stool that isn't designed for the job. Not only are you at a higher risk of injury, but you're at risk that you may not have a WorkSafe claim honored if you do that, because you're not allowed to do that. And in some cases, the correct tool is a different person. You may not possess the expertise to start messing around with breaker boxes, for example, or to go into areas that are enclosed. And in those cases, you really need to make sure that you're calling in people who are properly trained, whether they're on your staff team, such as the facilities people in a school, or whether they're contractors in the community, like plumbers or handymen. Know your rights and your responsibilities. So for this, again, I want to remind you to go and Google WorkSafe BC employer rights and employee rights, and take notes. Make sure you know what their rights are and your responsibilities to one another, because we're going to talk about it and it'll be part of your assessment. That wraps up this module, and that wraps up my lecture videos. Again, make sure you watch all of the linked videos as well and know the content, because it'll be part of how you're assessed.